The city was a patchwork of smells: gasoline, frying meat from street stalls, damp concrete after last night's rain. For most people, these scents blurred together into the background, but for him, they were the only map he had. His ribs pressed against thinning skin, his paws were cracked from miles of wandering, and his tail, once fluffy and upright, now hung limp like an afterthought. He had no name, no collar, and no one waiting for him. Every day was a silent war for survival. At dawn, he would nose through overflowing trash bins behind the baker's shop, dodging the broom of the old man who ran it. In the afternoons, he lurked near the food market, tail tucked between his legs, hoping someone would drop a piece of bread or a bone too small for them to care about. He learned quickly that humans in a rush never looked down, and humans with kind eyes often came with outstretched hands, which meant cages, and cages meant cold metal walls and no way out. Nights were worse. When the streets went quiet, shadows grew longer and sharper. The alleys became hunting grounds for bigger, meaner dogs who had their own territories marked by tooth and claw. He had scars to prove what happened when you crossed into the wrong patch of asphalt. Sometimes he curled up behind a rusted dumpster, nose buried under his front paw to block the wind, listening to the steady drip of a leaking gutter. On rare nights when the wind carried the scent of grilled meat or stew from a nearby apartment, he let himself imagine what it would be like to sleep indoors, on something soft, maybe even warm. But the thought never lasted long. Hope was dangerous out here. Hope got you to trust. Trust got you hurt. The only constants were hunger and the road. He had learned to read the rhythm of the city. When the shop owners swept crumbs into the street, when the trash trucks came, when the bakery tossed out unsold bread, he was a ghost in his own home, darting in and out of sight before anyone could decide they cared enough to catch him. People were unpredictable. Some bent down with open palms, others shouted or kicked. He kept a safe distance from all of them. To them, he was just another stray, one of the dozens wandering these streets with matted fur and wary eyes. But to himself, he was more than that. He was a survivor. And in his world, surviving was the closest thing he had to living. It was late afternoon when he first saw her. The sun was sliding low, painting the cracked pavement in orange and gold, and the food market was thinning out. He had been trailing a man who smelled of roasted chicken, keeping a few paces behind in case a scrap fell. But the man turned into a building and shut the door before the dog could make his move. Disappointment was nothing new. He turned to leave when he noticed her, standing near the edge of the market, a paper bag in her arms, scanning the street as if she were searching for someone. She was dressed in a faded denim jacket and had hair pulled back loosely, strands catching the light. He wouldn't have noticed her otherwise, but then she crouched low, her eyes meeting his from across the sidewalk. Most people's stares were sharp, assessing, but hers was still. She didn't call out, didn't clap her hands, or make the clicking noises humans often did. Instead, she reached into her bag, pulled out something wrapped in paper, and set it on the ground. The smell hit him instantly. Warm, salty, with the unmistakable scent of cooked meat. His body reacted before his mind could catch up. His paws moved a step forward, then stopped. Traps came in many forms: the shelter vans that left food out, the shopkeepers who lured strays close before chasing them with sticks. But she didn't move. She just stayed there, crouched, her hand resting on her knee, eyes still locked on his without a hint of threat. Minutes passed. The street noise softened, replaced by the gentle rustle of paper in the breeze. Hunger clawed at him, but instinct held him in place. Then she did something strange. She stood, turned her back to him, and walked away, leaving the food behind. No one ever did that. He waited until she had disappeared into the crowd before edging forward. The food was still warm when he took the first bite, and for the first time in weeks, he ate without having to snarl or run. By the time he licked the paper clean, she was gone. But the scent of her lingered faintly in the air, woven between the smells of the street, a mix of soap, fabric, and something he couldn't name. He didn't know it yet, but this was the moment the rhythm of his survival began to shift. The next day, he told himself it was coincidence. He wasn't looking for her. He was just passing through the same stretch of market because that's where the food was. But as the afternoon light began to soften, he found his paws drifting toward the same corner where the paper bag had been set down yesterday. He stopped halfway, scanning the crowd with the sharp eyes of an animal who had learned that safety came from distance. And then there she was. Same denim jacket, same slow, steady way of moving through the noise. She noticed him almost instantly, but instead of walking straight toward him, she veered off to the side, knelt near a lamppost, and placed another small bundle on the ground. This time, it smelled of rice and chicken still warm. She didn't stay to watch him eat. She just stood, gave him a brief glance, and walked on. It became a pattern. Every few days, she would appear, sometimes at the market, sometimes near the bakery's back alley, always with something wrapped in paper or tucked into a small container. She never tried to touch him, never spoke a word, and never stayed long. Her presence was quiet, deliberate, like she understood that trust was something too fragile to rush. At first, he kept his distance until she disappeared from sight before approaching the food. But over time, his legs moved faster, closing the gap before she had taken more than a few steps away. She would glance over her shoulder, the corner of her mouth lifting in the faintest smile, and then keep walking. Weeks passed, and the city grew colder. The wind carried hints of winter now, sharper and less forgiving. Food on the streets became harder to find, and the comfort of those paper-wrapped meals became more than just a kindness. They became a lifeline. He began to recognize her scent before he even saw her. The mix of clean laundry and something faintly floral, a smell that no longer meant danger. And one evening, when she knelt down and stayed there just a little longer than usual, he took 2 cautious steps forward, then 3. He stopped just short of her outstretched hand, close enough to see the warmth in her eyes, but far enough to bolt if the world suddenly turned cruel again. She didn't move. She didn't push. She simply let him be close. And in that silent moment, the wall between them began to crack. The day it happened, the city sky wore a warning. Heavy clouds rolled in from the horizon, bruised purple and slate gray, swallowing the late afternoon sun. He had been lingering near the market again, half expecting her, when the first drops fell, fat, cold splashes that darkened the dust at his paws. By the time he slipped into the narrow alley behind the bakery, the rain had turned into sheets, hammering the rooftops and rattling gutters. Water pooled quickly along the cracked pavement, swirling with bits of trash. He curled against the wall, nose pressed into the crook of his front leg, trying to make himself smaller against the chill. But the wind pushed the rain sideways, soaking his fur to the skin. The air smelled of iron and mud, and the rumble of thunder rolled through his chest like a growl from something ancient. The flooding came fast. The alley where he had taken shelter began to fill with water, creeping up over his paws, then his legs. He tried to back toward the street, but the only way out was already a rushing stream, pulling debris into the gutters. Panic clawed at him. Every instinct screamed to move, but every escape route seemed worse than where he stood. Then, through the roar of the storm, came the faint sound of footsteps splashing against the pavement. She appeared at the mouth of the alley, her jacket plastered to her shoulders, hair matted against her face. She was shouting something he couldn't hear over the rain, but her voice cut through the chaos all the same. She waded toward him without hesitation, water climbing up to her knees, one hand outstretched as if to calm him. When she reached him, she didn't try to grab or corner him. Instead, she crouched in the rising water, her breath visible in the cold air, and simply held out her hand. Her eyes were steady, even as rain ran down her cheeks. For a moment, he froze, the fear of being trapped battling the fear of the water rushing at his legs. Then another loud crack of thunder shook the air, and instinct took over. He stepped toward her. She scooped him into her arms with a gentleness that startled him, cradling him against her chest as she fought her way back toward the street. Her heartbeat was loud against his ear, steady even as the storm battered them both. By the time they reached the cover of a nearby building, he was trembling, not from fear this time, but from the sudden warmth of her hold. In that moment, something inside him shifted. She was no longer just the woman who brought food. She was the one who came back for him when the water was rising, and that, in his world, meant everything. Her apartment was small, but to him, it felt like stepping into another world. The air was warm and smelled faintly of bread and soap, a sharp contrast to the wet, metallic tang of the street outside. She set him down gently just inside the door, her hands lingering for a moment before pulling away. The floor was smooth under his paws, strange and slippery compared to the rough grit of the pavement. He stood there, dripping, muscles tense, ears swiveling at every new sound. The hum of a refrigerator, the soft ticking of a wall clock, the faint whoosh of a heater. Part of him wanted to bolt, to find the way back to the familiar cold air and endless sky. But another part, the part that remembered her arms in the storm, told him to stay. She moved slowly around him, giving him space, peeling off her soaked jacket and swapping it for a dry sweater. Then she disappeared into another room and returned with a towel, crouching low to his level. He flinched at first, but her touch was gentle, firm yet patient as she worked the damp from his fur. She spoke for the first time since they'd entered, soft words, meaningless to him in sound, but steady in tone, like a melody without an end. When she was done, she left him to explore, retreating to the kitchen where the smell of simmering broth soon filled the air. His paws carried him tentatively across the room, nose to the ground, cataloging every corner, every shadow. There were no snarls here, no growls from bigger dogs, no sudden kicks from passing strangers. Just walls that held in warmth and a quiet that felt almost alive. When she placed the bowl on the floor, steaming broth with soft pieces of chicken and vegetables, he hesitated only a moment before eating. It was richer than anything he'd tasted before, warming him from the inside out. She sat nearby, cross-legged on the floor, not watching him too closely but present enough that he could feel her there. When he finished, she slid a folded blanket toward him, close enough for him to touch, but far enough to let him choose. He sniffed at it, then circled twice before curling up on its soft surface. For the first time in years, he fell asleep without one ear open, his breathing slow, his body uncurled. And though he couldn't name it, deep down he understood. This was more than shelter from the rain. This was the beginning of something that felt dangerously close to belonging. Morning light spilled through the thin curtains, painting soft gold across the room. He woke to warmth, not just from the blanket, but from the quiet weight of safety pressing around him. She was already awake, sitting cross-legged on the floor with a steaming mug in her hands, watching him with a smile that reached her eyes. There was no rush in her movements, no sharp commands, only the gentle rhythm of someone who had decided to make space for him. He stretched, paws splaying, tail giving a small, uncertain wag before he caught himself and froze. Old habits whispered caution, but the way she tilted her head and set her mug aside made it feel safe to let it happen again. She disappeared into another room and returned holding something small, a simple brown leather collar with a silver tag that glinted in the light. She knelt down and placed it on the floor between them, letting him sniff. It smelled of newness, of leather and metal, but beneath that was her scent, familiar now, layered with every memory of the meals, the patience, and the storm. She picked it up slowly, waiting for his eyes to meet hers, then fastened it gently around his neck. It was snug but not tight, the tag catching the light just enough for him to notice as it moved. She spoke a single word then, clear, deliberate, like she was giving him a gift. He didn't understand the sound's meaning, but he understood the way her voice softened when she said it. It was his name, his first real name. The days that followed blurred into a rhythm he had never known before. Walks down streets where no one chased him away. Meals that came without scavenging or fear. Nights spent curled at the foot of her bed, the steady sound of her breathing anchoring him to a place he could finally believe was his. And yet, it was in the smallest moments that the truth settled in. The way she would glance at him when unlocking the door and say, "Come on, let's go home." Or the way her hand would find the top of his head when they passed strangers, as if to tell the world, "This one's mine." He was no longer just a dog surviving the streets. He was hers. And in the quiet language that needed no words, He told her every day that she was his too. She had called him family, and for the first time, he understood what it meant.